Welcome students. I am Miss Masha Rodriguez, Assistant Professor from Carmel College of Arts, Science and Commerce for Women. Today's lecture is for the program Bachelor of Science Second Year, Subject Botany, Semester 3, Course Code BOC 103, Course Title Plant Anatomy and Embryology. Title of the unit, Unit number 6, Pollination and Fertilization. Module name, Pollination Mechanisms and Adaptations. Outline, Introduction, Pollination, Types of Pollination, Floral Mechanisms favoring cross-pollination, Pollination Agencies. Learning Outcomes, defines pollination, lists the different types of pollination, describes the floral adaptations for pollination, explains the floral mechanisms favoring cross-pollination. So students, let us start with today's module, that is pollination mechanisms and adaptations. Pollination is defined as the process of pollen transfer from anther to the stigma of a flower. The pollen grains are formed in the pollen sacs, which are completely enclosed by multi-layered anther wall. Therefore, for pollination to occur, pollen grains have to be released from the anther. Anther dehiscence is the release of the pollen grains from the anther chambers or the pollen sacs. It is necessary for male fertility of the flowers. Anthers that have viable pollen but fail to dehisce are as good as sterile anthers. Now let us study the types of pollination. As you can see in this slide, there are two types of pollination. First one is self-pollination. The second type is cross-pollination. We will first look at self-pollination. In self-pollination, pollen grains are transferred from an anther to the stigma of the same flower. Now this is possible only in those plants which bear bisexual flowers, that is, it has both androecium as well as gynoecium. In self-pollination, anther dehiscence and receptivity of stigma occur simultaneously. In case of cross-pollination, pollen grains are transferred from an anther to the stigma of another flower. Cross-pollination is further divided into two types. There is geitonogamy and xenogamy. Geitonogamy is the transfer of pollen grains from anther of a flower to the stigma of another flower on the same plant. It functions like a cross-pollination but similar to autogamy genetically. In case of xenogamy, pollination occurs between two flowers on different plants. In xenogamy, genetic variation is observed. Now, let us learn about floral mechanisms favoring cross-pollination. Flowers which are unisexual, cross-pollination is very essential. However, in certain plants with bisexual flowers, self-pollination is prevented through the following ways. That is, through self-sterility, dichogamy, hercogamy, and heterostyle. We will now look at each of these ways. Self-sterility. It is the inability of the pollen grain to germinate on its own stigma. There is failure of fertilization and it is self-sterile or self-incapacitating. compatible. For example, in the plant Petunia axillaris, growth of the pollen tubes formed upon self-pollination is inhibited in the mid part of the style. Next is dichogamy. This refers to maturation of male and female reproductive organs at different times. In this case, there is protandry, which means the anthers dehisce much before the stigma of the same flower attains receptivity. That means anthers become mature first and later on stigma becomes matured. Next is protogyny. In this case, the stigma loses receptivity by the time anthers dehisce. So in case of protogyny, it is the gynoecium that becomes matured first, and then later on the anthers become mature. Now we will look at hercogamy. In this case, some bisexual flowers, the structure of the male and female reproductive organs itself proves a barrier to self-pollination. So the structure is such that it is preventing self-pollination. In certain flowers, the stigma projects beyond the stamen so that the pollens do not fall on it. Next is heterostyly. The flowers may be of two or more types, with regards to the length of the style and length of the stamens. Pollen from a flower can bring about effective pollination in flowers of a different type and not within its own type. Now we will learn about pollination agencies. Pollination agencies can be broadly categorized into two groups, that is abiotic agencies and biotic agencies. With regards to abiotic agencies, the pollinating agents are non-living. So there is wind and water. Wind pollination is known as anemophily, water pollination is known as hydrophily. With regards to biotic agencies, the agents include living organisms such as birds, bats, insects. So pollination that is brought about by birds is ornithophily, by bats it is known as chiropterophily, and insects it is known as entomophily. Now we will learn about anemophily. Anemophily is wind pollination, and flowers are small and inconspicuous, and perianthropes are reduced or they are absent. Now in this case, the flowers produce large quantities of pollen, and the pollen grains that are produced are small, light, smooth and dry, so that they can be carried by the wind to long distance. The stigma should be large and feathery, or brush-like, and projects beyond the floral envelopes, so that the pollens that are there in the wind are trapped by the stigma, and this brings about pollination. Next is hydrophily. This is referring to water pollination. In this case, the floral envelopes are highly reduced. Hydrophily is of two types. There is high hydrophily and there is euphydophily. High hydrophily refers to pollination which takes place inside water, whereas euphydophily refers to pollination which takes place outside water. Next is ornithophily. In this case, pollination is brought about by birds. With regards to ornithophily, the floral adaptations are as follows. The flowers are tubular, cup-shaped or urn-shaped. Flowers are brightly colored in order to attract the birds. flowers produce large quantities of pollen and plenty of nectar. The pistils and stamens project beyond the floral envelopes. Next is chiropterophily. In this case, pollination is brought about by bats. Flowers are dull in color and they open only at or after dusk. So that means flowers open after sunset because bats are active at night. When the flowers bloom, they emit a strong odor which has been described as musty or resembling sour milk. And these flowers produce large quantities of nectar. Lastly is entomophily, and in this case, pollination is brought about by insects. Some of the insects which help in pollination are bees, flies, wasps, moths, and beetles. Bees are colorblind for red, but they are fond of yellow, violet, and purple. Okay, they visit flowers to collect their food, that is pollen and nectar, and in the process they prove instrumental in bringing about pollination. So students, in this lecture we have learned about pollination mechanisms and adaptations. That is, we have first learned what is pollination, what are the different types of pollination, that is self-pollination and cross-pollination, and then under cross-pollination there are two more types, that is getinogamy and xenogamy. Then we learned about the floral mechanisms which favor cross-pollination, that is dichogamy, hercogamy, heterostyle, and self-sterility. Then we learned about pollination agencies. Okay, there are two types, abiotic agencies and biotic agencies. Under abiotic agencies, there is wind pollination, water pollination, and under biotic agencies, we learned pollination that is brought about by birds, bats, and insects. These are the references for the module. Thank you, students.